Lecture 29, Orthodoxy on the Continent and Britain. 1. During and after the military battles, Orthodoxy and Lutheranism, Calvinism, and Anglicanism continued to develop. 2. I mention Anglicanism separately from Calvinism because though its creed is Calvinistic, many in that church held aloof from the Reformation as if it were a via media between Protestantism and Romanism. You'll still find that in Anglicanism today. That is, that the Church of England, of people around the world, loosely connected with the church at any rate, has as its official creed the 39 articles, and they are Calvinistic. They include the doctrine of special election. They teach justification by faith alone, and this is properly should be counted with Reformed theology and the Calvinism of the continent, and in the beginning it was. People like Latimer and Cranmer and so on were identified with Calvin and the Reformation, just as John Knox in Scotland was. But with the Oxford movement especially of the 19th century, Newman, an Anglican clergyman who became a cardinal in the Roman Catholic Church, and its general movement in that direction, though many, like Pusey, were strong Anglicans who were high churchmen and so on, but very definitely not Roman. Nevertheless, this impact of the 19th century that elevated inclined toward Rome and took a good many Anglican into Rome and so on, has been responsible, I think, primarily for dislodging Anglicanism from its traditional status as a genuine Reformation movement. The creed itself is Reformed, and their position is historically Calvinistic. They're Baptarian, and they are high church, and they have a Episcopal form of government, which is sort of a minority report among the Calvinists, but it nevertheless exists. And when John Calvin himself was asked about the Church of England and its Episcopal form, he urged people to remain in her, work with her, even though he would not have been pleased with that Episcopal was taught in the Bible. But at any rate, as a result, apparently, of this movement, Anglicanism has come to think of herself as something in between Romanism and Protestantism, or Reformation doctrine especially, and she's neither one nor the other. She is her own self, as it were. She's the via media between the two. But that is a new thing, however. She was definitely with the Protestant Reformation at the beginning, and speaking creedally, she still actually is with it. It's a funny thing about the Church of England, as anybody knows, that its history has been characterized by latitudinarianism. In non-ecclesiastical language, it's the British ability to muddle through and so on, to be imprecise at certain points that makes it a much more tolerable group, and for many people, a much more tolerable group there that accounts for this phenomenon that is a widespread of belief in the Anglican Church, the high church, the low church, and a church in between. Warfield said at the turn of the century to some evangelicals in the Anglican Church of their time, "You oughtn't to apologize for being in the church or claim some sort of place under the umbrella. You are the Anglican Church." What he meant is this is an evangelical and a Reformed church according to the creed. But these people who were acting as if they were being a tolerated minority, as they are today, you have strong evangelicals in the Anglican church, but they are also a noted minority. But Warfield was saying at the beginning of the century they had a claim to have the only right to being members of the Anglican church. It is not a via media church. It is a Protestant Calvinistic church according to her creed. But be that as it may, I agree with Warfield on that, but be that as it may, the Church of England generally doesn't see herself that way. She sees herself as capable of tolerating thoroughgoing Calvinists such as J.I. Packer, and on the other hand, a bishop who wrote Honest to God, and who is as far out of the Christian orbit as you could very well get and still call yourself Christian at all. But at any rate, because of that characteristic, historically speaking, I talk about the Anglican church as well as the Protestant and the Roman church, but I don't like to do it. Number 3, later Methodism broke with the Anglican church and with the Calvinistic Reformation as well. I think you realize that John Wesley began life as an Anglican rector, indeed the son of an Anglican rector. But at the same time, though his conversion took place later, it always was in a church which affirmed the 39 Articles. He himself departed from the 39 Articles and from the historic Calvinism of the Church of England. His good friend George Whitefield reminded him of the fact that in being Arminian, which Wesley was, he was not being honest with his vows. You're in a church which has a Calvinistic confession, John, he would say. You have no right, really, to be a rector in the Anglican church, believing as you do, and the idea of perfection, for example. That's definitely denied by the 39 Articles, but that was a major tenet in John Wesley. And Whitefield also reminded him, you have no right to be anti-predestinarian, anti-predestination in a church which affirms the doctrine of predestination. It was a rather tense moment between these two good friends, the Calvinistic evangelist George Whitefield and the Arminian evangelist John Wesley. They not only had debates about the nature of grace and great struggles with each other, at the same time they tried to maintain their friendship with each other, but Whitefield pretty somber when he raised the question of integrity and honor with his friend John Wesley. This always strikes a chord with me, because if you're going to be in a creedal church, you've got to believe that creed. That's the only way you enter it. And if you don't believe it, you're a dishonest person at the outset. This is what's happening to the church at the present time. And this is people will often ask me, how does a church with a creed like that get to be as corrupt as it actually is? Well, there's a double answer there. The people who respond to the creedal questions are often liars, and those who ask them are frequently careless. There's a double error here. The church authorities don't enforce the doctrine by careful examination, and those who are examined have no scruples about telling the lie. The new wrinkle that has come in the 20th century that you don't see mentioned in the 18th century, when John Wesley was violating the vows he so solemnly swore to uphold and so on, is the situation ethic. This has tried to make honest people out of liars. That is, people who say they believe the Westminster Confession or the 39 Articles or even the 25 Articles of the Methodist Creed or whatever. They lie, and they admit they lie, but they justify their lying, saying, we want to do good for mankind, and we think that this particular church is a good instrument for doing good, but the only way to get into that church and use it for the doing of good is to subscribe its creed, to which you cannot honestly conform. So, what do? You tell a lie and you're justified by the situation. The situation is to do good, and the only way to do good is not by telling the truth, by telling a lie. And consequently, we have an even more rapid rate of degeneration and corruptionizing of the existing churches, but there was enough even in the 18th century to show that that type of eating at the foundations was taking place. And when you find a person like John Wesley, for example, or Charles Grandison Finney in the 19th century in these countries, these are people who are outstanding saints, you know, people whom God has used mightily. The man nevertheless lies if he says he's an Anglican and is a rector in that church. Finney was a Presbyterian for a while. To become a Presbyterian, he had to subscribe to the Westminster Confession of Faith, which he admitted later he never even read. Well, thousands of people seem to have come to Christ through Charles Grandison Finney, and probably even more through the instrumentality of John Wesley in the preceding century. What do you make of a thing like that? Is God blessing liars? Does he approve of endorsing something you haven't even read? Well, you know full well he doesn't. What he is honoring is the element of the gospel which John Wesley did preach, and the element which Charles Grandison Finney did preach, and so on. But it shows that even apparently godly people can tell lies. And today we got people, as I say, who by their situational ethics justify their lies. These people wouldn't like to be called liars. John Wesley was very uncomfortable when Whitefield accused him of not believing what he vowed to believe. Finney would never sit still for someone calling him a liar. They knew full well you can't properly be a Christian and be a liar at the same time. These people lie with ease. They justify their lie, make it ethical to lie. As I say, this peculiar kind of ethics, which is a product of the last century, the last half of the century in which we're living and so on, has made it even acceptable in certain kinds of circles, morally commendable in certain kinds of circles. But to go on to number 4 here. Lutheran Orthodoxy followed the pattern of the Book of Concord faithfully, solidifying the Arminianized Calvinism of Melanchthon and the Book of Concord. I've explained that enough. I think that you get it there, but let me take just a moment to make sure. The Arminian tendency, remember, in Lutheranism is a strange thing because Arminius was a Reformed person. Lutherans don't use the word Arminian, but we pointed out the way in which a full-orbed biblical Reformed theology is first attacked is at the point of human freedom, and in the case of the Lutheran doctrine, that the person himself could resist. Person could resist the work of the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit must regenerate, but the Holy Spirit can't regenerate if the person resists it. Now, that means, of course, the fundamental principle that Arminius states in the positive way, that person must come of himself to Jesus Christ. He must exercise positive faith. This is implicit faith. He doesn't have that kind of faith, so he has an implicit faith in his own right to resist the Holy Spirit and his ability to do that, resist the work of the Holy Spirit. That's an Arminianizing tendency in a church where Arminius did not live and where he's not read and where his name is not well known, but the fundamental principle is the same as I've explained in more detail in the past. 5, I explained earlier what remained true in the era of Chemnitz, Gerhard, and Holotz, namely that Lutheranism felt itself true to Luther in affirming regeneration's priority to faith without recognizing that the notion that the regenerated could reject that faith vitiated Luther's Calvinistic thinking. The one thing I'm adding there is the name of Chemnitz and Gerhard. That is what we call orthodoxy. You see, 16th century is basically Reformation. The 17th century is basically the orthodoxy period. These were the pioneers. These are the people who cleared the way. These are the people who laid the foundation. And once that was done, then, of course, the successors build on that foundation. And in this century, both in the Reformed circles and in the Lutheran circles, you had the giants of systematic theology. They produce huge Latin tomes that size that are very hard to come by anymore and very, very expensive, but massive pieces of learning. I think I can tell this story out of school at a conference that we had, about 50 evangelical scholars from around the world back in 1966 at Wenham, Massachusetts. Bob Preuss, a student of Lutheran Orthodoxy, and myself, a student of Calvinistic Orthodoxy, were there. And these scholars who were writing papers and all of us who were engaging in debates and so on were very formidable, very impressive and so on. But Preuss and I, who worked in this period, a really great orthodoxy of the Lutheran and the Reformed variety, said to ourselves after about 2 days at the conference, in 10 days, these men are not going to get half as far along as Orthodoxy had in the 17th century. That if we could persuade them to start with the Orthodox, we might make some progress. See, what we meant is that the greatest development, systematically, of the Great Reformation period came in the 17th century. There's been a good deal of decline since that time, though those who aren't historically sensitive are not aware of that. And Preuss and I were saying, if they were aware of that, many of the questions which were coming up every day on the floor in this discussion and so on had been worked out to a fine point by 17th century orthodoxy. But most of the people didn't know it. They were New Testament specialists, or they were working in practical theology or systematics, but had never worked in historical theology very much and weren't aware of their heritage and were going over old ground that had been subjugated long before. But at any rate, you get my message. The Reformation was God's outpouring of the Holy Spirit in abundance and a remarkable transformation of Europe. And then came the century of consolidation of the gains and building up of the structure that the pioneers had laid. And it behooves us today not to make that the final point of advance and say we can't go beyond this and keep saying forward to orthodoxy, meaning the 17th century and so on, but at least we ought to build on the heritage which we have. And it was a great and a noble heritage. The Lutherans realize it. That's the best kind of Lutheranism ever had. Luther would have admired it thoroughly, and the same way with Calvinism, the greatest era. And we don't have anybody on the scene today who compare with a man like Francis Territon, and you could have nobody I know of who you mention in the same breath with Van Maastricht or people like that, or William Ames. It's just something we ought to be aware of and re-examine. And it's being done, of course, and some very fine work is being done, and there's a good deal of new appreciation for these men, and many of these Latin works are being translated for our use. There's a whole company of conservative scholars who are trying to raise money and get people lined up to translate this, that, and the other work, and they're being noticed more and more in encyclopedia and so on. So I may say to you people who are listening here, this was the golden age of orthodoxy. It behooves our present brazen age, as it were, to learn something from our historical path. And when you see young scholars coming along who are interested in working in this area, encourage them, pray for them, and give to them if they need your financial help as well. Number 6, the sacramentalism, better called, I would think, sacramentalitis, remained and remains unchanged in Lutheran Orthodoxy, and today threatens Reformed Orthodoxy. I've already pointed out to you, remember what I mean by Lutheran sacramentalism, which even Martin Luther didn't get free of. That is the idea that when that child is brought for infant baptism, it is regenerated. Now, what Luther introduced that wasn't there before was the idea of some sort of infantile faith. But you know, it's hard to believe that an infant can exercise a faith when it has no understanding at all of what the object is, with a kind of futile effort, I think, on Luther's part to salvage evangelicalism, even while he was capitulating to this ex opere operata principle. That is, that when the sacrament is administered, that which it symbolized is produced in the soul. One thing is certain, that Luther himself is responsible for Lutheranism falling into that particular type of sacramentalism, which amounts to virtual baptismal or certainly baptismal regeneration at infancy. So sacramentalism, better called sacramentalitis, remained and remains unchanged in Lutheran Orthodoxy, and today threatens Reformed Orthodoxy. See, Reformed Orthodoxy never fell into that. Calvin verged on it, but he never developed the way Luther did, and Calvinistic Orthodoxy skirted around the edges of it, but never ever capitulated to it, and so on. I'll explain in time what I mean by saying it threatens today even Reformed Orthodoxy, which has tried to stay, and actually successfully tried to stay, aloof from that particular error. Number 7, as Lutheran Orthodoxy tended to vitiate Luther's Reformed Orthodoxy, the predestinarianism and all, as Lutheran Orthodoxy tended to vitiate Luther's, Reformed Orthodoxy tended to improve on Calvin's until recently. If Lutheranism weakened Luther's strength in this area, Calvinism strengthened Calvin's weakness or incompleteness. I think you understand what I mean, and if you don't, I don't think I have time right now to explain it. Maybe I can get back to it if that clock has any mercy on me in these last 5 minutes here. Number 8, Calvin tended to treat the children of believers as elect, barring them from the Lord's Supper only because they could not discern the Lord's body. Now, you realize what I mean then by saying that Calvin himself tended to fall into the same sacramental danger. He doesn't say it. He doesn't talk about baptismal regeneration. He never affirms it at all, as I'm afraid Martin Luther did, and Lutheranism has followed him in that. But Calvin, in his Institutes and the sacramental discussion in the 4th book and so on, Calvin speaks of baptized children as if, at least, they are true Christians. He'll turn to Christ's words, of such is the kingdom, and tell you that means those children are Christ's children. And you can tell from that and a dozen other allusions which he makes that he really is entertaining the idea. Now, he never mentions baptismal regeneration or infers that, but he's entertaining the idea that these children who are baptized are not only elect, but must be regenerate. Because, he says, they can't take the Lord's Supper because they can't discern the Lord's body. See, that's the same thing as saying they're the Lord's children. They would be qualified if they were old enough, if they were discerning enough, if they could know what they were doing when they took the sacraments. Calvin would see no objection to admitting them. The only objection he offers is the fact that being very, very young, infants are very, very young, they can't discern the Lord's body. Well, that certainly is an implicit statement that these children are born of God. And of course, if they're born of God, according to John Calvin, they're eternally elect. So you see, here's Calvin moving in that direction, that the child somehow, in connection with its sacramental relationship to baptism, is God's child. Number 9, Calvinistic orthodoxy made clearer that what the sacraments symbolized was not necessarily united with the persons who received them. Here's where Calvinistic orthodoxy of the 17th century and the creeds is making an improvement on John Calvin. Calvinistic orthodoxy made clearer that what the sacraments symbolized was not necessarily united with the persons who received them. Now, you can see Calvin's not saying that it is, but he certainly seems to be inferring it. These are treated by Christ as little children who are believers, as little Christians and so on. They could presumably be admitted to the Lord's Supper, except that they don't understand the meaning of the Lord's Supper. how that particular error was cleared up very neatly by the creeds and by the great theologians of the next century, whereas, see, the Lutherans followed the error of Luther in this area and became deeper immersed in it. Thank God the Calvinistic tradition detected the error of their great reformer and tended to correct it. Number 10, contemporary Calvinism is tending to return to Calvin's weakness. We'll see this before we finish the course, but right now, let me just remind you what we're saying here. In the great golden age of Orthodoxy on the continent and in Great Britain, we have a fulfillment of the promise of the Reformation and the classic works of Christian theology which are not being matched in subsequent centuries. We have to go backward to go forward in that particular area. If we're going to make progress, we're going to have to make it on the basis of what has been achieved in the past. But one has to admit that the great Lutheran Orthodox achievements of the 17th century unfortunately did not correct Luther, but went further in his error and did deviate from his great understanding of the doctrine of predestination. Calvin, on the other hand, didn't quite make the same mistake, but he approximated it, and we're happy to say that the subsequent great theologians of the Calvinistic tradition in the 17th century detected that mistake and corrected it. And then I have to end with the lugubrious note that in the 20th century we are coming perilously close to the error which John Calvin made, and I hope God will spare us from falling into.